Hello, welcome to the Thematic Intelligence podcast. At Global Data Thematic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Hugo Shapiro, and today I'm joined by Laura Petrone, Principal Analyst at Global Data, and Alexandra Kamerling, Competition Partner at DLA Piper, to discuss the future of tech M&A regulation, and in reference to our recent tech M&A regulation report, available on all Global Data ICs and the report store.
Hi, welcome Alexandra and Laura. Thanks for coming on the Thematic Intelligence podcast. Great to have you both. I wonder if you guys could just talk a little bit about the last time you met.
I believe it was in 2019. We've been having conversation around regulation, but in 2019 we worked together on a podcast and a webinar on antitrust.
Yeah, it's always great fun to talk to Laura because I think we're looking at issues in relatively fast developing area where you can see across the globe increased scrutiny and increased deal activity. So sort of the two go slightly hand in hand.
Great, guys. Thank you so much for that. And now we'll just move into the questions.
So, why has M&A activity come under increased scrutiny over the last few years?
Well, I see a number of reasons for that. So firstly, the number of M&A deals in digital markets has increased significantly over the past decade or so. And some of this activity has risen concerns from regulators that companies, and especially big tech companies, have been engaging in anti-competitive behavior. And yeah, indeed, a big chunk of the deals done by big tech companies, targeted smaller companies and startups. Despite the fact that some of them had anti-competitive effects, they typically escaped scrutiny because they were below the notification threshold for revenue that would require regulators to intervene, to investigate. So regulators have realized that, in the past, they've let these companies do a number of killer acquisitions. So acquisition made with the aim of destroying potential competitors. And now they believe they must stop these companies from doing so. How would you say M&A regulation today fits into this broader picture of antitrust as an area where big tech is increasingly targeted?
If you stand back, I think what we can say is that there's clearly been an evolution in sort of the understanding of the potential competition risks that these ever-growing sort of big tech companies create by expanding into sort of either adjacent markets or sort of acquiring innovative startups. And so, sort of your identification of, they've now become so-called killer acquisitions, where they buy a small innovative company. And the question then is, could that small startup have been potentially with a rival technology to the big tech company, or are they just assuming it? And I think the sort of the identification of what sort of the antitrust risks were, or sort of the theories of harm, as we talk about it in merger control scenarios, the sort of the various cartel investigations or the abuse of dominance investigations that the regulators had engaged in over sort of the last decade or so. And that meant that within the antitrust authorities, you had case officers who were building up an internal expertise to understand the potential harms, and also an increased recognition that rather than facing, sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 years and then appeals on an antitrust case, regulators would be better off trying to nip this in the bud with ex-ante scrutiny. And so moving away from sort of after the fact infringement investigations, they've now moved to try and basically preempt these problems by increasing the merger control scrutiny when these transactions are implemented. And so it's a trend. It's, we saw this in other industries as well. So, historically, it was your ex-state utilities that were seen to have sort of significant economies of scale and potential sort of competitive advantage. And now the focus has moved very much to these big tech companies where, although they might be asset light, they have very significant sort of intangible assets that are now being recognized as actually also having a sort of a potential competitive advantage for them.
So I think we can understand from some of what both of you have said why this could be the case, but why do you think it is so difficult to ascertain whether a merger could be harmful to competition in a digital market in particular?
So I think while regulators have definitely got a much better understanding of the potential theories of harm, the whole sort of technology space is a very fast moving and very innovative area. And so therefore it's much harder to pin down what is actually the relevant product or service market that you're looking at. Furthermore, very often you've got two-sided markets, which also add to the complexity of trying to understand what the potential theories of harm are. And so trying to anticipate when a merger takes place, what the prospective potential future harm to competition is much harder to ascertain. You're not looking at, sort of seeing what are the economies of scale of combining, factory A and factory B, or product A and product B, but rather trying to understand integrating certain intangible assets and effectively talent and software engineering and things like that, and what effect does that have going forward. And you can see how regulators are grappling with these issues in terms of trying to work out, is a merger going to be harmful or not to future competition, where you then end up with some regulators coming up with slightly different decisions than other regulators. And you can sort of see very often some of the factor or matrix that they're looking at might be similar, because these are very often sort of global transactions, but the subjectiveness comes in terms of when they have to try and debate whether are remedies sufficient to address the harm that they've identified at this point in time, or whether a deal should actually be prohibited. And so that came to very significant sort of public outcry in, for example, Microsoft Activision, where the EU said, yes, there is a potential for harm, but we are satisfied that it can be addressed with remedies. And the CMA in first instance said, actually, we're concerned that these remedies aren't going to be enough to address the competitive harm that we have identified, and they prohibited it. And so you can sort of see how they're grappling with trying to predict what the potential impact of a implemented transaction might be.
I agree. And it's also difficult that in a way these are quite different as compared to traditional markets. Do you think that traditional markets are single-sided? So there is only one group of participants, the consumers, who feel the burden of monopoly, who feel harm through higher prices. And on the other hand, you have digital markets connecting different sides. So you have consumers, of course, but you also have advertisers or developers and publishers. And because of this complexity, it's definitely more difficult to assess whether there is harm to competition and who among all these different sides is being harmed. So this actually means that competition authorities must make an extra effort in their analysis to understand the effect that M&A deals can have on these different groups in digital markets, in digital platforms. I think it's also difficult to prove that the intent of a merger is actually to kill a competitor, and whether this is actually damaging to innovation. So you need specific information to identify the innovative companies that are operating in the same or closely adjacent markets to the ones where the incumbent platforms operate. And big platforms most of the time are more likely to have such data than the regulators themselves, the regulators responsible for assessing the impact on the market of M&A activity. But regulators, I think, can nonetheless apply more scrutiny to prevent this acquisition. They can collect and require from the acquirer more information to assess whether the proposed merger is actually a killer acquisition, and that's what regulators have started doing over the past few years.
No, I agree. I mean, I think sort of picking up on a couple of your points, Laura. One, I think your point about sort of two-sided markets and very often sort of different implications of a merger, where it might actually be beneficial for one side of the market to sort of have the greater economies of scale and the wider network, and for the other side, the potential users to sort of be more limited in choice as to which platform they go to, because there is that sort of the network effect. And so while they might benefit from better products and better service, they are then left with less choice potentially. And so there are conflicting interests. The second point, I think, is a very valid point that you sort of say, it's understanding, we are at the cutting edge of innovation. And so for a regulator to understand what a company is trying to do with a particular acquisition and where they see the sort of the benefits of an acquisition, and using sort of whatever has been sort of developed, the know-how or the talent behind some of the creative software engineering that goes on. And so they are coming to rely more and more both on very extensive internal document review to try and find that smoking gun amongst the internal documents that identifies what the competitive advantages that they see in doing a particular transaction. And secondly, they are turning more and more to third parties who are active in the same industry to sort of help them understand what the potential implications are going to be of a particular transaction. And so we've noticed as a firm that, for example, increasingly, either third parties themselves are willing to come forward, or the regulators are using their more extensive powers to force third parties to provide information so that they can better understand the market. And so all of that then adds to the information that a regulator has to review and extends the timetable of these deals, because it's such a complex assessment that needs to be carried out.
So I think this leads us nicely into our next question, and you both sort of hinted at this with your previous answers. But what are the main developments in terms of M&A regulation, and what are the future implications for the TMT industry?
So first of all, we are seeing that merger control, which is the main tool that regulators have at their disposal to prevent anti-competitive mergers. So we are seeing that this merger control regime is going through some important changes. And what we see is that you have regulators in the European Union, but also in US and UK, tabling some legislative proposals to adopt merger control to digital markets. And they are all overall adopting a tougher stance.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a legal perspective, there are almost four major developments. Some of them are specific to big tech companies, and others have implication for big tech mergers. So for me, firstly, there is the changes to general merger control thresholds. You're picking up on your comment, Laura, about killer acquisitions. A lot of the regulators has realized that their traditional standard turnover thresholds didn't necessarily capture all transactions that might raise concerns. And so they've included transaction value in order to capture some of these sort of technology deals where the turnover may be very little, but there are other aspects that make the deal very significantly valuable. And that is, for example, being the case in Germany, where they introduced the transaction value as a threshold. The second thing that I've noticed, and that's actually slightly more recently, is that we are beginning to see quite a few regulators that are sort of passing legislation in order to be able to call in mergers that don't hit regulatory thresholds. So they don't actually need to be notified in advance, but where the regulator identifies that there might be something that they need to look at. And so they've now passing legislation to give them the ability to call in transactions that don't hit the thresholds. In the EU, that is done through the mechanism of referrals from a member state up to the European Commission, where they can do that even if a transaction doesn't hit thresholds. And then there are countries like Ireland and the Netherlands passing this legislation in order to have these powers. The third point I'd say is, and this applies specifically to tech companies, is that if you are or have been identified as, for example, a gatekeeper under the European DMA Act, then you have a mandatory reporting requirement, which then can mean that your transaction gets called in. In the UK, for example, they're also passing legislation that is going to be specifically targeted at what they're calling strategic market status players, And they equally have different merger thresholds that are going to apply and make it mandatory for them to notify. And that's quite interesting because obviously in the UK, it's one of the few regimes where normally notification is voluntary. So it just ups the ante in terms of making people realize that these transactions are subject to regulatory scrutiny. The fourth point that I would raise is that historically, regulators were very much more focused on horizontal overlaps between the acquirer and the target company and whether that raised concerns because it increased market share and therefore market power in a particular industry. With these tech mergers, they're realizing that actually vertical issues can be as important because, for example, a big tech platform can potentially self-preference or sort of exclude players from a market. And so things like the new US merger guidelines now explicitly elevate the potential risk in vertical mergers almost to the same level as horizontal mergers. And then I think the final point, which I've already mentioned, is an increased use of third parties in order to understand the industry dynamics and carry out the competitive assessment. So I think for big tech companies, what are the future implications? More complex issues to be considered, greater deal scrutiny, and frankly, a much longer deal timetable.
What about scrutiny over AI-related deals? It looks like M&A deals and investments in smaller AI companies will be on regulators' radar too.
Despite this uncertainty around the future of AI, we can definitely say that the race to profit from it by big tech companies will attract intense scrutiny from regulators. And you can already see this. So you already see competition regulators in the UK and in the US starting to examine Microsoft's investment in OpenAI. Just today, Microsoft announced a partnership with Mistral, the French AI startup. So this will mean that Mistral large language models will be available on Microsoft's Azure platform, so similarly to OpenAI. And so we can say that this was, in a way, an attempt from Microsoft to appease regulators' concern initially that it is, in a way, diversifying its investments on AI. But yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen whether regulators will be appeased.
Yeah, I mean, I think from sort of a legal perspective, I think the regulators are, one only has to read the newspapers to sort of see the sort of the hype around just what a game changer generative AI is becoming. And so all of the regulators are very much aware of that. And so we've had speeches from the likes of Vestager in the EU, the French and the German and the UK competition authorities, all warning about the risk of effectively combining big tech with sort of AI capabilities, and that how that might well increase barriers to entry into innovation for smaller companies. Because if you can imagine, things like large language models all require a lot of big data and the cloud and access to chips, and also sort of the deep pockets in order to recruit the best software engineers, which effectively favors the big tech companies over smaller rivals. And so to the extent that you have these big tech companies entering into sort of ancillary markets and gaining a foothold in AI, there is a potential for that to really impact the competitive dynamic landscape. And then I would say that in AI, you've also got the issue of foreign direct investment, national security concerns. And so you've got an added layer of additional filings that very often are required increasingly across the globe, because again, there is this concern of how can the AI be used? Can it be used for sort of, dual purpose, i.e. military and civilian aspects and things like that? And so we're noticing that, sort of any transaction that touches on an AI investment often also requires not only merger notification, but also national security filings alongside. So as people grapple to understand what exactly AI can do and what the potential of it is, I think the regulators are going to be sort of quite cautious in terms of what the potential implications of any deals are going to be.
Well, thank you so much for joining, and we hope you enjoyed our insights, and we'll see you on the next episode.